What's going on, everybody? Khalip's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some pros and cons for the Motorola Moto G Power 2022. Now, this phone came out recently within the last couple months, and as the name implies, it is the successor to the previous model of this phone, the Motorola Moto G Power 2021. Now, there have been some interesting changes that Motorola has made to this phone, so to learn more about those, be sure to check out my full review of this phone and my comparison to the older model on the channel. But with all that being said, let's get started. So my first pro for this phone is the storage. Now, this phone is getting 64 gigabytes of internal storage with microSD card expansion. And while that's not a huge amount of storage per se, especially in a world where there are phones that have 256 gigabytes, 500, sometimes even as high as a terabyte, but for a phone in this price range, it's not uncommon to see only 32 gigabytes. In fact, the previous model of this phone, the Motorola Moto G Power 2021, while still having a 64 gigabyte variant, did also have a 32 gigabyte variant. And in my opinion, no matter what kind of usage you have, 32 gigabytes in this day and age just really isn't enough. Even for the average user, you're probably going to go through that pretty quickly, with apps, system data, and pretty much everything getting larger and larger as time goes on. Nowadays, it's more important than ever to have extra storage. So with this phone having 64 gigabytes, you're definitely going to get a good amount. Now, of course, if you're a power user and you have a bunch of different apps, maybe some higher quality photos and videos, stuff like that, then you might actually want to look for a phone that's a step up from this and has 128 gigabytes. But again, for the average user, 64 gigabytes in this day and age should be pretty good. My second pro for this phone is the battery. Now, this phone has a 5,000 milliamp hour battery, making it among the best you can get in terms of battery life. This phone's going to get a ton of life throughout the day. In fact, it'll probably be able to go multiple days without being charged. And in addition to that, you're also going to get a lot more longevity out of this phone because as batteries degrade, which all of them do, you're not going to notice it nearly as quickly because with a 5,000 milliamp hour battery, you're already going to get way more battery life than you need. So it's going to take a lot longer to degrade to the point where you actually notice it not having a whole lot of battery life anymore. And as a result, you're going to be able to keep this phone for a longer period of time without needing to replace it. So if you do like to get one phone and keep it for a while, and you don't really like the idea of getting a new phone every year, then the size and longevity of this phone's battery is going to be a huge benefit for you. My third pro for this phone is the display. Now, the Motorola Moto G Power 2022 is getting a 6.5-inch IPS LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 270, an aspect ratio of 20:9, and to top it all off, a 90 Hz refresh rate. Now, in case you don't know what it does, a 90 Hz refresh rate is basically going to make the movement on the screen a little bit faster and smoother. I don't really know if you can actually tell the difference from here, but basically, it's more of a subtle difference. But when you're doing lots of content consumption, like streaming videos, playing games, that sort of thing, you are definitely going to notice it. And in general, when a phone has a 90 Hz refresh rate, it usually feels a little bit more premium to move, just because when you're scrolling through the home screen or whatever you're doing, things tend to just look a little smoother. So although this phone doesn't have a 1080p display, we do at least get the premium feel of a 90 Hz refresh rate. And in addition to this, for just being a 720p display, the image is decently sharp and crisp, and I think it looks really good. The colors are also nice and bold, and the display in general is pretty bright. A lot of the time in this price range, you'll get a phone that has just a regular LCD display, and it's super dim even at 100% brightness and has terrible viewing angles, whereas with this phone, while the viewing angles aren't amazing, they're definitely pretty good. Another nice thing about the display is that in addition to being decently large at 6.5 inches, it also has a nice tall form factor, which means if you're reading, you'll be able to fit more on the screen so you won't have to scroll as much. And when you're watching videos in landscape mode, it's going to look nice and cinematic. And of course, since the display is larger in general, everything is going to show up larger on it, making things easier to see. My fourth pro for this phone is the security options. Now, this phone has both a fingerprint scanner right here on the back, as well as face unlock. Having two options is always a good thing because you may find yourself in a situation where one might not end up being too convenient at the moment, and then you can just use the other. Or if you just happen to have a specific preference, maybe you prefer the fingerprint scanner, or maybe you'd rather have face unlock, well, with this phone, you don't need to worry because both options are available. So either way, you'll be able to lock and unlock your screen in a way that's comfortable and convenient for you. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and give this fingerprint scanner a try and see how well it works. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, this fingerprint scanner is real fast and responsive. So as far as security goes on this phone, it's definitely good. Now my fifth pro for this phone is the camera quality. So just to give you a quick rundown of this phone's cameras, up here in the front, we got an 8 megapixel front-facing camera, and as you can see, it is a hole punch design. I really like the placement of this too. The Moto G Power 2021 actually had the front-facing camera right here off to the side, and while it didn't look bad, I think this looks a lot better. Now on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera for portrait mode, and a 2 megapixel macro camera. Now, I'm not thrilled that there's no ultrawide camera because that's such a common and useful feature to have. And it really is too bad that they took it away last year because the Motorola Moto G Power 2020 actually had one, but the Moto G Power 2021 didn't. So I was kind of hoping that they would bring it back with this phone, and they didn't, so that is a little disappointing. But besides that, the camera setup is actually really good. To give you an idea of what this camera can do, this is a photo taken with the main camera. It captured the colors and details and pretty much everything really well. Definitely a nice high quality photo. My only complaint here is really, I feel like it could have been brighter. The lighting definitely could have been captured better, but that actually is pretty common for phones in this price range. Usually the photos aren't nearly as bright as something like a flagship phone, but for what it is, this phone can take some really nice photos. Now this is a photo taken with portrait mode, and as you can see, this looks really nice as well. I really like how the background is blurred perfectly without distorting the subject, because in a lot of phones that are lower end like this, there is a lot of distortion around the edges, and there's really not in this photo. So in general, if you want to take some nice photos for social media or something like that, this phone is definitely going to get the job done. Now keep in mind that compared to a $1,000 flagship phone, this phone's camera is not going to be anything near that quality. So if you're expecting something that's really professional level, you will be disappointed with this phone. But for what it is in this price range, the Moto G Power 2022 definitely has a really good camera, and when it's used properly, it can get some real nice photos. So now that we've gone over some of the good things about this phone, let's go over some of the drawbacks. My first con for this phone is the processor. Now this phone is getting 4 gigabytes of RAM with the MediaTek Helio G37 processor. Now I will say 4 gigabytes of RAM for a phone in this price range is actually pretty decent. I can't knock that, that actually is pretty good. But compared to a lot of other phones, in fact compared to the predecessor of this phone, the Moto G Power 2021, this phone is actually a little bit slower. Now I haven't had any performance issues, but I was definitely expecting a little bit more since after all, the newer versions of phones are supposed to be faster, not slower. So that was a little disappointing, but I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and it came back with a single core score of 183 and a multi-core score of 1027. Now these scores don't really mean a whole lot unless they're compared to something, so I do recommend running a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on your current device and comparing it to this to see if this phone would be an upgrade, because even though I was a little disappointed with this processor, if you're coming from a phone with a much slower processor, you might actually find the performance of this phone to be rather impressive. But in general, if you're just doing more basic activities like sending text messages, making calls, maybe some light web browsing and social media use, you should be fine. But if you're going to be on your phone a lot, or doing more high-end activities like gaming, you're probably going to want to look at a phone with a faster processor because you're really going to notice it struggle with heavy use. My second con for this phone is that there's no ultra-wide camera. Now I touched on this when we were talking about the camera setup in general, but I still do think it's pretty disappointing that this phone doesn't have one, seeing that a lot of phones, if not most, in this price range do have ultra-wide cameras. It's such a basic but useful feature that I don't see a reason why a phone shouldn't have one. My third con for this phone is that there's no NFC. In case you don't know what it is, NFC is the main technology behind contactless mobile payment services like Google Pay. So without NFC, you're not going to be able to use Google Pay or anything like it. And with that feature becoming more and more common as time goes on, I would think that in 2022, most new smartphones would have NFC by now. It's not really a very hard or expensive feature to implement. In fact, I've seen plenty of lower end phones that have it. And unfortunately with Motorola, very few, if any phones at all, actually have NFC. So that's one huge disadvantage of not only this specific device, but the vast majority of Motorola's budget phones. So I do hope that in the future, the newer versions of these phones do start to get NFC, because nowadays, that feature is becoming more and more relevant and important. My fourth con for this phone is that there's no wireless charging. Now this is really nitpicky because wireless charging is not a game changer by any means, and it's not even really that common of a feature, but all the same, it would have been nice to see on this phone because it is pretty convenient. And not only that, but it can also be really useful if, say, your charging port breaks. With this phone with no wireless charging, you would basically just have to throw it away and get a new phone. But if you had wireless charging, you'd be able to keep the phone a little longer since you could charge it on a wireless charger instead of having to plug it in. Now my fifth con for this phone is the materials. Now first of all, I will say the design of this phone in general is pretty decent. It doesn't look too bad neither on the display nor on the back. I do like this wavy texture here, and it's decently slim as well, so it's not going to be uncomfortable to hold in your hand or carry in your pocket. But I will say, as I hold it, this really doesn't feel very premium at all. In fact, it barely even feels durable. The back is made of a plastic that just doesn't feel the greatest quality, and even though it's a matte material, it picks up fingerprints a lot more than I would like. So while it's not really a big deal, because this is a pretty low-end budget phone after all, if you're looking for a phone that has some weight to it and feels pretty premium, or at least a little bit nicer than average, even in this price range, there are definitely better options out there. But those were my pros and cons for the Motorola Moto G Power 2022. Despite a few shortcomings that admittedly were a little nitpicky, this phone for what it is a great device that's going to provide a lot of value if you're looking for an entry-level phone for basic activities. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you did, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and as always, I will see you in the next video.